I'm Mr. Jed and I have another reaction video for you. And this one is called Why the Troubles Started in Northern Ireland. Alright, so I've known a little bit about it, but not why it started, and I like a little history of it and things. So hopefully this video goes into some vibe like that. Let's YouTube and simmer and see what this is all about and thing.
This is the Falls Road in Belfast, and this is the Shankill Road. These two areas are just a few streets away from each other, and yet there is a border running between them. This vast wall stands on the first peace line in Northern Ireland. First built nearly 50 years ago as a temporary barrier to divide two communities, there is still a wall standing here today, a physical symbol of the deep divisions within Northern Ireland. Northern Ireland was formed in 1921. When Ireland seceded from the UK, 6 of Ireland's 32 counties remained as part of the United Kingdom. The governance of these counties has been contested ever since, sparking the bloody 30-year conflict known as the Troubles. In this 4-part series, we'll be taking a look at the history of the Troubles and why the scars of this conflict remain. But first of all, let's take a look back to see what marked out the 6 counties of Northern Ireland in the first place. Religious tension in the north of Ireland dates back hundreds of years, and some of this can be traced to the plantation of Ulster.
You see, here's the thing about history that people don't pay attention to, like especially I find that here. People see certain things happening around the world and they just assume that it's modern politics, you know what I mean? Oh, those people are crazy, they this, they that, they the other. But they don't look at the history of things. How did this come to be? Why are these people still, or why are these people reacting to the powers that be or each other in the way that they do? Like, you know, in the 70s, or you know, when the Northern Ireland and the Irish, the Troubles were, if people don't, I didn't know the history of it. I was young, so I didn't know the history of it in order to quite understand why it is where it is. And that tends, and people take sides because of now, because of what's going on right now, instead of paying attention to what is the history that leads up to that. They have that problem in Ukraine. When I start telling people that the conflicts have been going on there for centuries and centuries and centuries, they look at me like, what? I'm just like, you don't understand. You just, modern politicians are using the conflict right now for their own political and financial benefits. Whereas people, the actual people who is in the middle of it, know the history of it, and they're fighting over the history of it, that's things that happen over the years. You see, people want to forget the slave trade, and well, let me put it, they want to forget the sufferings of Africans coming to this country, because they don't want to look at the history to see why it is where it is and the ramifications of the history. Okay, racism did not start, slavery is not because of racism. However, racism in this part of the world, I'm not speaking in here in America, racism stems straight from slavery. The whole idea that somebody is less than you because of the color of your skin, that's where it stems from. So you have to talk about where it comes from in order to try to understand where it is now. Because most people, if they're racist against you here, they are looking at you as the ancestors of slaves, because I've been called that before, you slave ancestor, or whatever they want to say. I've been called that before. So it comes directly from there. So you know, we have to understand that, realizing concretely that this was wrong, and we shouldn't use that to make somebody feel less than now. Nobody's saying that racism is, slavery was because of racism. A lot of people are saying that slavery is not because of racism. We already know that. But that doesn't solve the problem that there is racism now, which is a derivative. And I'm repeating myself. I know I'm repeating myself, but it seems like that has to be said. You understand? Let's get back to this here.
At the end of the 16th century, an Irish alliance rose up to fight against English rule, and a lot of the unrest took place in the province of Ulster. At the end of the 9 Years' War in 1603, James VI and First, King of Scotland and England, set out to colonise and subdue the north of Ireland.
He sought to undertake an official plantation of Ulster to ensure its loyalty and to stop uprisings happening ever again. In this he planted mainly lowland Scots and some from the north of England into 6 of the 9 counties of Ulster. Earlier in 1603 there had been private plantation by Presbyterian Scots in the counties of Down and in Antrim. But the actual official policy starts in 1609, and it's really there to secure this part of the country in a way that will make it not be able to rise in rebellion again.
Over the next century, Europe was engulfed in religious wars. James II, the Catholic King of England, Scotland and Ireland, was overthrown by Protestant William of Orange in 1688. A few years later, James's supporters, the Jacobites, attempted to restore James to the throne. Supported by French forces, the Irish Jacobites fought the Williamites in Ireland. The fighting culminated in two major battles, the Battle of the Boyne and the Battle of Aughrim.
The Battle of the Boyne in 1690, although not a decisive battle, is very significant. A year later, in 1691, at the Battle of Aughrim, the Jacobite forces of James are actually destroyed and he is defeated. Aughrim itself, although less well known, is by far the more strategically important of the two battles, but the Boyne has a much larger geopolitical effect. And even today still, William Orange is a figure we see, particularly during the Loyalist marching season, which culminates on the 12th of July.
Religious conflict, as with much of Europe, was causing great divisions within Northern Ireland, but another struggle was also continuing to grow, the fight for independence from British rule. In 1845, a potato famine broke out across Ireland. The famine reinforced to a lot of Irish that although they were now part of the UK, they were not considered equal. As Irish people starved, the British continued to export food for profit. Over 1 million people died. The famine sparked rebellion and new calls for independence. Over the 19th century, there were multiple bills proposed for Home Rule. The first was proposed and failed in 1886. The third attempt passed in 1940.
See, according to the video here, some of it was religious too. Now, I know that the people in Ireland probably understand that there's a religious part of it. I don't really think that people outside of Ireland, like ordinary people who see the conflict that was going on during the Troubles, understand there's also a religious effect going on there too. You know what I mean? They just think that it's just two political groups that are fighting. And even today, if you talk to people about it, that's who they see. They don't see that there was also a religious thing that was also incorporated into it. Because probably due to lack of educating people, which is probably the case about here, because they won't educate them about Irish history. They don't know. So it's easy to make it, if this was to have an issue right now, people would just look at it as total political, and then they'll pick sides without knowing the true history of it.
14, but it was put on hold due to the First World War. Irish Republicans decided to take action. They staged a rebellion over Easter week in 1916.
The Easter Rising is planned as far back as 1914 by Patrick Pearse of the Irish Republican Brotherhood. There are a number of other groups involved, one of which will go on to become the IRA in 1919. For a week, there is a great deal of violence and there are a high level of casualties that's eventually put down by the British Army. Now, whether or not this would have gone away afterwards changed dramatically in the way that the British sought to deal with the leaders of the uprising. Many of them were actually executed by firing squad, and this and things such as the conscription policy that the British tried to introduce in Ireland again hardened republicanism. And eventually Sinn Féin, a party who was formed back in 1905, which had been a nationalist party not linked with armed or violent republicanism, becomes a Republican party. It wins the 1918 general election and instantly declares an independent Ireland.
But support for the Union remained strong in the north, leading to the Irish War for Independence, largely fought between the IRA and the British government. In 1920, Home Rule was finally granted and Ireland was partitioned. It was meant to be a temporary solution to end the war, but the government in the south never formed, and the war continued until a ceasefire in 1921 and the Anglo-Irish Treaty, which granted Ireland a limited independence. The South became a free state, but still had to take an oath to the king. This agreement was not entirely popular, leading to a bloody civil war between those who were pro-treaty and those against. In 1923, the pro-treaty Free State forces prevailed, cementing the Anglo-Irish Treaty and the two-state solution, with a region in the north remaining part of Britain. The border had been drawn around 6 counties in Ulster. In some places, the border was drawn directly through the middle of towns and villages. Ulster contained 9 counties. The 3 that had been excluded were Donegal, Monaghan and Cavan. This was devised by Unionists so as to ensure a Protestant majority in the new state. But although the 6 regions had a Protestant majority politically, there was a substantial Catholic population across the region. Voting was manipulated to advantage the Unionists.
Gerrymandering.
The only people you could vote for sometimes were Unionists, or there would often be no point in actually putting up a candidate from a nationalist party because it wouldn't be enough of a vote for them to actually carry any win through. There were actually other things such as gerrymandering was used as well, most starkly in the city of Derry, Londonderry, which was an overwhelmingly nationalist community but continued to return Unionist politicians the way the boundaries were drawn up. Not only was gerrymandering an issue, also if you were not the ratepayer or the rent payer on a house, even if you were of voting age, you couldn't vote in local elections.
It's amazing the thing that these politicians create to manipulate and gain their power. I mean, oh, it's free, we could vote, and then they fix it so that a majority could be in a certain place to vote so they could get voted in. And they know that the ordinary person wouldn't quite understand that. We're beginning to understand it, but the ordinary people wouldn't pay attention to that. They just know they're going to have to go vote, you know what I mean? But if they gerrymander, then their vote don't really count, and you know, a lot of people are starting to realize the tricks and stuff that they pull to get into power, even today as we speak in this environment here, and that they've been doing that for centuries up, and it's been working like a charm, I guess.
Further discriminated against working people. Access to jobs was another area where the nationalist community would often seem to be prejudiced against, such as the big shipbuilding works in Belfast would have an overwhelmingly Protestant workforce. But this is actually a hotly contested issue in the sense that if you didn't have a relative working in one of these factories, no matter if you were Protestant, you would often be prejudiced against as well. And on top of that, women found it very hard to get roles in some of these jobs as well.
It was in this environment, with Catholic residents consistently seen to be disadvantaged, that the civil rights movement grew among the nationalist communities.
There was no promotion. You know, if you were a Catholic, you just didn't get promotion.
It's kind of strange hearing Catholics being oppressed, especially since I came from. And I mean, I'm not saying it didn't happen or it never happened or anything like that. It's just that I'm from a Catholic country. In my country, when I was there, was probably about 85 to 90% Catholic, you know, and they were the dominant religion. And to hear that they were like discriminated against like that is just something else. And I know there was to a certain degree that happened here in America too. But now, to be Catholic means you're rich in this country, which is really odd, you know, how things just switch and change.
There is civil service. If you worked in England, in London, you would get promotion, there's no. But if you were in the Northern Ireland civil service, there were people who weren't as experienced as you who were promoted over you. Housing was another thing. That was the start of the civil rights movement. There was a young single girl got a house where a Catholic family didn't get it, you know. I never mixed, never had any Protestant friends until I started nursing, really. But it's still there, the hatred, deep hatred, it's dreadful.
Communities and attitudes became deeply polarised through near 30 years of conflict in Northern Ireland. Many of the events that took place during this time are hotly contested. Moreover, they are highly disputed as well. Often starkly and highly diverse versions of events exist on both sides, and many people will never come to a point of agreement on what happened on certain days at certain times.
Throughout the late 60s, tension was rising. In 1969, at the annual Apprentice Boys of Derry March, violence erupted. The route of the march passed through the predominantly Catholic Bogside area of Derry, Londonderry, resulting in violent clashes between the marchers and the residents.
Several days of rioting ensued, the police became involved, weapons were fired.
Wasn't this parade made a yearly thing? I don't know if it's still going on now. Comment down below, let me know, because I've heard of this before, and I think I watched a documentary a long time ago. It wasn't this one, about that march going through there and the ramifications of it. Comment down below, let me know if that's something that's still going on.
Battering ram guns were used, stones were thrown, and bits of the bogside were shut off to the police. When the police moved into the bogside, loyalist groups moved in behind them. This was probably not the police's intention, but it galvanised opinion within the nationalist Republican community. In the same sense, violence broke out in other parts of Northern Ireland as well, and people were burned out of homes in both loyalist and Republican communities. And the troubles at this point really begins in Northern Ireland.
In 1969, the IRA split and a breakaway group who called themselves the Provisional IRA formed. Divisions in the IRA had been growing through the 1960s. In 1962, the new IRA Chief of Staff, Cathal Golding, sought to move the IRA in a different direction. He was keen that the movement became political in its outlook rather than one that relied on armed struggle, which to traditional Republicans was seen as a betrayal of their cause. They saw their task as the defence of nationalist communities and the expulsion of the British from Ireland. Loyalist paramilitaries such as the Red Hand Commando, the Ulster Defence Association and the Ulster Volunteer Force also grew in numbers. Ian Paisley was a Presbyterian minister who established himself as an outspoken leader within unionism, leading marches throughout the 60s and 70s. As the rival groups grew, tensions rose. Over these decades, violent attacks and bombings increased in frequency, and barricades went up to separate the two communities. The Provisional IRA escalated their armed campaign against the British and Northern Irish security forces. Many nationalists saw the Provisional IRA as defenders of their community, and loyalists saw them as dangerous insurgents. In reaction to this violence, the British Army were deployed on the streets in Operation Banner. They were called in to support the RUC and protect infrastructure and civilians, but ultimately their presence served to escalate the situation.
We've come now to IWM's conservation studio to have a look at this weapon here, which is a baton round gun, which was used by the British Army and the Royal Ulster Constabulary in riot control situations. This type of weapon could fire a variety of ammunition from CS gas canisters, but more usually rubber bullets and more latterly plastic bullets. The British Army was deployed in Northern Ireland in 1969 at the behest of the then Prime Minister, and it changed the relationship with Northern Ireland and the rest of the United Kingdom, where now the British government itself took a more active role because the army were very much within their control. Initially, in some areas they were seen as being protective and helpful of the nationalist Catholic community, but as the situation developed in Northern Ireland and the army's role became more intense, they were no longer seen as a neutral actor. Although seen as an effective form of crowd control, if used incorrectly, the bullets could in themselves be fatal. There were a number of fatalities caused by rubber and more latterly the plastic bullets, which were at the time thought to be less lethal, but turned out to be no less so. This was often seen as a fairly heavy-handed approach.
See, I remember hearing about these rubber bullets, and that's just crazy how I'm watching this and I'm remembering bits and pieces of the stories that came out of that back in the day.
And nationalist communities often saw that they were the ones more targeted by British soldiers with these particular weapons than those in loyalist communities.
In 1970, the Ulster Defence Regiment was formed, becoming the largest regiment in the British Army.
They consisted of people who came from Northern Ireland. They didn't go home, they didn't have tours of duty, they came from the community from which they defended. Although there was a drive to include Catholics in the recruitment and some did join, it largely was unsuccessful because of pressure in nationalist and Republican communities, and also because the force was seen, as with the Royal Ulster Constabulary, the police force, to be overwhelmingly Protestant, and was viewed from a nationalist Republican standpoint as being a tool of the oppressor, if you will. The UDR did draw controversy. There were accusations from Republicans of collusion with loyalist paramilitaries, some of which may have been true, others may have been overstated. Even within the loyalist community, many of them didn't see them as friends either, whereas others saw them as neutral. So their position was difficult and it was dangerous, and it certainly was controversial at times.
And I think that was the hardest thing any of us had to deal with. The fact that this was a United Kingdom city, and yet you were there as though you were in the middle of a war zone. It was a war zone. It was a war zone. And there was a lot of violence and a lot of anger. You had all that debris from the first riots or the burnt house streets and things.
And what were the people like?
The ones that were friendly were very friendly, but the ones that weren't were the exact opposite. You got stoned and bottled and petrol bombed and all the rest of it in the Protestant area just as much as you did in the Catholic one.
Wow.
You really were piggy in the middle.
The British Army arriving in Northern Ireland faced a difficult challenge. In their efforts to defeat the IRA, hostility from the Catholic community grew towards the British Army, and this was severely aggravated by the introduction of the Fool's Curfew in July 1970. What started off as a search for weapons in a Catholic nationalist area resulted in clashes between local residents throwing petrol bombs and the British soldiers firing CS gas. In response to this clash, the entire area was sealed off and a curfew was imposed. Large amounts of weapons were seized by the British troops, but in the process of the operation, 4 civilians were killed and dozens others injured. The same month in the House of Commons, the UK Home Secretary declared, "We are now at war with the IRA." The following year, the policy of internment sparked further anger. Operation Demetrius involved the imprisonment without trial of suspected IRA members. The British Army conducted sweeps and arrested more than 340 people from Catholic and nationalist backgrounds. But due to faulty intelligence, many of these people in fact had no connection to armed republicanism. The treatment of some of those arrested was later categorised as torture.
Wow.
We're standing in front of a cabinet here in the galleries, and in here we have a poster which is a protest against the Northern Irish government's policy of internment in 1971. These initial sweeps caused 4 days of rioting in which over 20 people died. Posters like these would have appeared on walls, on lampposts, etc. in Northern Ireland at the time as a protest against what was felt to be an unjust policy targeted against the nationalist community. Indeed, loyalists would not be subject to the same internment without trial until 1973.
The backlash to internment was strong. It sparked a lot of violence, a recruitment boost for the IRA, and a deepening of divisions between loyalists and nationalists.
1972 was the worst year of violence in Northern Ireland, but from the couple of years before that, the violence had been escalating. Northern Ireland was starting to appear in the news regularly at nights. And civilians bore the brunt of it as far as casualties were concerned.
There seemed at this point to be no resolution in sight, but the worst was still to come. The presence of the British Army and the growth of the paramilitaries all ramped up the violence of the Troubles. The IRA had already split, but their strategy was about to entirely change. As the violence increased and spread beyond Northern Irish borders, the road to peace would not be easy.
Okay, I didn't realize this was like a 4-part series, so I'll keep watching this here. This is quite interesting. I hope you guys enjoyed watching this with me. I'll leave a link in the description for this video thing, you know what I mean? And hey, you know, let's try to spread some peace, like I say on in the community section. Go out and love a stranger, alright? You all take care of each other. Cool runnings.